Have you ever noticed how history remembers the loudest names, while faith is often carried forward by the quiet ones? We celebrate builders, conquerors, and kings, but rarely pause to honor the steady souls who simply stood where God placed them. In a world that rewards noise, it's easy to believe that significance must be dramatic, but Scripture tells a different story. Long after the floodwaters receded and the headlines of judgment faded, God quietly wove His promise through the life of one man whose faith spoke without shouting. And it is through that quiet obedience that hope found a future. Shem enters the biblical story almost in the background, one of Noah's 3 sons who survived the flood. While Noah is remembered for building the ark and obeying God against all odds, Shem's role unfolds after the waters recede. He is not recorded giving speeches or leading rebellions. Instead, Scripture portrays him as a man who honored righteousness when others drifted. When Noah stumbled in a moment of shame after the flood, it was Shem together with Japheth who covered their father with dignity, refusing to expose weakness for mockery. That simple act revealed a heart aligned with God's ways, valuing honor over ridicule and reverence over impulsive judgment. From that moment, Shem's life becomes a spiritual thread woven quietly through generations. God's blessing spoken by Noah did not emphasize territory or wealth, but relationship. Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. That blessing points beyond Shem himself to a lineage marked by devotion rather than dominance. Through Shem's descendants would come Abraham, the covenant people of Israel, and eventually the birthline of Jesus. While empires rose and fell through other family lines, God's redemptive plan flowed steadily through this quieter branch of humanity, showing that divine purpose does not depend on visibility, but on faithfulness. Shem lived in a world rebuilding itself from ruin. The earth was raw, nations were forming, and humanity was rediscovering what it meant to live under God's authority. In that fragile season, Shem's faith mattered deeply. His descendants preserved knowledge of God when others chased power, idols, and self-glory. Even when human pride later reached for heaven at Babel, God scattered the nations but preserved His promise through Shem's line. This was not accidental. God often chooses continuity over charisma, consistency over applause. Shem's story reminds us that the presence of God often rests most powerfully on lives that appear unremarkable to the crowd. From Shem's life, we learn that honoring what is holy shapes generations long after our moment has passed. Covering his father was not a dramatic miracle, but it aligned Shem with God's heart. In our own lives, the quiet choices to guard someone's dignity, to resist mockery, to respond with grace may feel small, yet they carry eternal weight. God sees those moments even when no one else does, and He weaves them into purposes far larger than we can imagine. Another lesson emerges in how God values spiritual inheritance over visible success. Shem did not build cities like some of his descendants in other lines, nor is he tied to monuments or empires. Yet through him, the knowledge of God endured. This reminds us that our greatest legacy may not be material achievements, but spiritual faithfulness. The presence of God does not cling to noise. It rests where hearts remain obedient. What we pass on in faith, prayer, and reverence may shape lives we will never meet. Shem also shows us that remaining aligned with God requires patience across long seasons. His story stretches across generations without spectacle, teaching us that walking with God is often slow, steady, and unseen. When culture drifts toward pride or rebellion, staying faithful can feel like standing still while others run ahead. But God's promises are not delayed by silence. They are preserved by it. Those who quietly stay rooted in truth create foundations strong enough to carry redemption forward. In the end, Shem's story reminds us that God's greatest works often grow from faithful anonymity. He did not need Shem to be famous. He needed him to be faithful. Through that faithfulness, the presence of God remained among humanity, guiding history toward restoration rather than chaos. As generations rose from the ashes of the flood, God was already at work, shaping hope through obedience that never demanded attention. So when you wonder if your steady faith matters, when your obedience feels overlooked, your prayers unheard, your choices unseen, remember Shem. God is not searching for the loudest voice in the room, but for hearts willing to walk with Him day after day. And when He finds such a heart, He builds futures upon it. Quiet faith may not trend, but it carries the promise of redemption, and in God's hands, it is more than enough.